I felt myself one with the grass, the trees, birds, insects, everything in nature. I exalted in the mere fact of existence, of being part of it all. I knew so well the satisfaction of losing myself in a perception of supreme power and love. These are the words of noted American philosopher and psychologist William James, describing what most people today would call a moment of transcendence. The transcendent experience is perhaps the most studied of all subjective phenomena in our little human universe, perhaps because human beings have been experiencing transcendent moments since at least the beginning of our recorded history. In the pre-modern age, transcendent experiences were often associated exclusively with states of religious ecstasy, perhaps triggered by ritual practices such as prayer, fasting, or dancing. But as philosophy and science developed over time, we discovered that transcendent moments transcended religion. Human beings all over the world were having these experiences, and they were not limited to any specific religious observance or any religion at all, for that matter. So it is little wonder that the transcendent experience has been dissected by theologians, philosophers, psychologists, and neurobiologists alike. So what is a transcendent experience? Author Emily Esfahani-Smith describes such experiences as transient moments when people feel lifted above the hustle and bustle of daily life. Their sense of self fades away, and they feel connected to something bigger. In such states, people typically report feelings of awe and rapture, of time stopping, and of feeling a sense of unity with other people, nature, God, or the universe. Abraham Maslow, famed psychologist noted for developing the hierarchy of needs, called transcendent moments peak experiences and associated them positively with individuals who had achieved self-actualization. He described them as rare, exciting, oceanic, deeply moving, exhilarating, elevating experiences that generate an advanced form of perceiving reality and are even mystical or magical in their effect. Theologian Josiah Royce, who coined the phrase beloved community, described transcendent moments as the obverse of feeling completely, utterly, and totally lost. I suppose one opposite feeling of lost is feeling found, which leads me to believe that the hymn writer John Newton was describing a transcendent experience when he wrote the words, "I once was lost, but now am found, was blind, but now I see." On the other hand, Sigmund Freud believed that transcendent states were a sign of pathology. Of course, he believed just about everything was a sign of pathology. He described such experiences as oceanic feelings of oneness and hypothesized that they were pre-birth memories of fetal life in the womb. Freud notwithstanding, most people, from religious gurus to scientific researchers to self-help authors, tend to agree that transcendent experiences are good for both body and soul. Researcher Gail Prevet, for example, found that transcendent experiences generated intrinsically rewarding emotions and increased personal awareness that often served as a positive turning point in the lives of those who experienced them. Other lines of research have demonstrated that transcendent moments leave people feeling more satisfied with their lives and help make life more meaningful. On a purely biochemical level, transcendent moments have been shown to raise levels of oxytocin in the blood, thus leading to feelings of deeper connection to other people. A 2008 Johns Hopkins study demonstrated that artificially induced transcendent experiences among terminal cancer patients resulted in significant decreases in depression and death anxiety, and high increases in quality of life, belief in a meaning for life, and optimism. 6 months after the experiment, 80% of those participants continued to show these positive effects. And in a 2014 study titled Awe, the Small Self and Prosocial Behavior, researchers had individuals look up at a towering grove of 200-foot-tall eucalyptus trees for just 1 minute. After that 1 single minute, the individuals reported feeling less self-centered, and they actually behaved more generously when given the chance to help someone. It is theorized that people experiencing transcendence become more generous and less self-centered because they, as the phrase goes, lose themselves in the experience. And they might be losing themselves quite literally. Neuroscience research has demonstrated that during transcendent states, there is decreased activity in the posterior superior parietal lobe of the brain. What is the posterior superior parietal lobe of the brain responsible for, I hear you asking? Well, that's the part of the brain that grounds us and orients us in both time and space. When it stops working, the brain can no longer separate the self from the rest of the environment. Hence the feeling of interconnection with all reality that so often accompanies a transcendent experience. All this research suggests that transcendent moments give us a holy sense of scale. They give us insight into just how small we really are, both spatially and temporally, in relation to the vast infinitude of the universe. They help us realize that though we are an interconnected part of this universe, we are not at the universe's center. But these realizations, these epiphanies, instead of filling us with dread or terror, they fill us with awe, gratitude, and peace. So there you have it. Transcendent experiences are amazing. We should spend our lives trying to have more of them. Clearly, they are one of the truly unqualified, absolute good things in this universe. Except when they're not. Everything in this universe casts a shadow, even transcendence. For instance, we all know that transcendent moments are often associated with prayer, meditation, being in nature, enjoying art and music, all good things. But transcendence can also be triggered by far less benign and potentially far more dangerous catalysts. Drugs, for instance. William James, whom I quoted at the very beginning of this sermon, became so enamored with transcendent states that he spent a significant portion of his life chasing after them, going so far as to artificially induce them by huffing nitrous oxide, also known as laughing gas. Modern researchers have been able to artificially induce transcendent states using psilocybin, the active ingredient in so-called magic mushrooms. Transcendent states have also been triggered by asphyxiation, starvation, and exposure. And on this point, I can speak a little from personal experience. Now, I count myself blessed to have experienced several moments of transcendence over the course of my life, not unlike what Donna shared with us earlier. Now, many of those experiences happened in religious contexts. Many also happened in the midst of nature. But one of my most intense transcendent moments came to me in a small, smelly gymnasium in the middle of Kansas. When I was a teenager, I was an amateur pugilist. That is to say, I was a boxer, but not a particularly good one. And frankly, I can pretty much guarantee you that any boxer who calls himself a pugilist is not a good boxer. And I was not. In my first sparring match, I was overmatched badly. I took a severe beating that day, so severe, honestly, I probably should have gone to the hospital. My problem was, and probably still is to this day, that when I get knocked down, I'm too stubborn to stay down. And I had a boxing coach who was happy to let me keep fighting so long as I kept getting up. So it was a perfect death that nearly ended in my death, a perfect storm that nearly ended in my death. The final time that I was knocked down, I experienced the most intense and surreal moment of transcendence that I have ever felt. Everything was warm and beautiful. I was inside and outside my body at the same time. In fact, I realized that my body was just a small part of all creation, and I felt like I was everywhere. Time and space had lost all meaning. I was not experiencing any pain. Now, my body had been on fire, pounding with pain, and then all of a sudden, it was all gone. I believe that I was experiencing that peace that passes all understanding. In that moment, everything was right because there was no such thing as wrong. Everything was beautiful because there could be no such thing as ugly. Most importantly, nothing mattered, including my own life. In that moment, my opponent could have jumped on top of me and literally beaten me to death, and I probably wouldn't have protested. Honestly, an armed gunman could have entered the gym at that moment, and that too would have been fine with me. Because in that moment, I knew that our little lives meant nothing, and I was so at peace with this most beautiful and sublime truth. I was reminded recently of this boxing story while reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' wonderful book, Between the World and Me. Near the end of the book, Coates describes the photographs taken in the 1960s of courageous black folks who were verbally and physically and spiritually assaulted at sit-ins in segregated lunch counters. He noted that in these pictures, they appear to, quote, look out past their tormentors and focus on something way beyond anything known to me. I think they are fastened to their God, a God whom I cannot know. Coates' description of how these civil rights era heroes faced such persecution reminded me of the stories, the old stories that I had heard of the Christian saints who reportedly faced their deaths with dignity and a preternatural peace that baffled onlookers. So the question I started asking was, were all these martyrs in the moments leading up to their deaths lost in a transcendent experience triggered by intense physical and psychological duress? And if so, what does that mean for all of us? My theory is that the ability to have transcendent experiences is a brilliant evolutionary adaptation developed by human beings to help prepare us for death. When death is imminent, if we are lucky enough to experience a transcendent moment, then we will ride off into death with the peace and the tranquility of a cowboy riding off into the sunset. If we have transcendent moments long before death, those experiences will help us cope with the ever-present anxiety and terror of truly understanding our own mortality, thus allowing us to live more meaningfully and more authentically until that day comes, so long as we don't overdo it. In a religious context, transcendent moments are often described as the moments when we are most deeply connected to God, when we come closest to realizing our own divinity. But our collective literature is full of cautionary tales warning us of what happens when we humans become a little too godlike. One of the most highly acclaimed graphic novels of all time is Alan Moore's Watchmen. In that story, a man by the name of John Osterman, as the result of a nuclear accident, begins to evolve into a godlike being. He is conscripted into military service by the U.S. government and given the fearsome name Dr. Manhattan. As the story unfolds, we see developing in John's character arc an inverse relationship between his godhood and his humanity. That is, the more powerful and omniscient John becomes, the less he cares about his former human connections and the value of human life in general. One online fan page described it this way: Dr. Manhattan's apparent lack of sentiment is more a matter of radically altered priorities, owing to a colossal, unbridgeable gap of perception between John and the rest of humanity. From his radically altered perspective, almost all human concerns appear pointless and without obvious merit. Now, on the same fan page, there's a section listing weaknesses for Dr. Manhattan. So if this were a fan page for Superman, under this weaknesses section, you would, of course, expect to see something like susceptibility to kryptonite. But under Dr. Manhattan's listed weaknesses appear these words: apathy and detachment. Alan Moore's Dr. Manhattan bears much in common with the view of God expressed in what is surely the most theological song in the impressive discography of Britain's most underrated rock band. The 1968 song Big Sky by the Kinks describes a God too big, too expansive, too transcendent to actually care about life on earth. Some of the lyrics go like this: Big sky looked down on all the people looking up at the big sky, everybody pushing one another around. Big sky feels sad when he sees the children scream and cry, but the big sky's too big to let it get him down. Big sky too big to cry, big sky too high to see people like you and me. One day we will be free. We won't care. Just you see, till that day can be, don't let it get you down. When I feel that the world is too much for me, I think of big sky, and nothing matters much to me. Now, based on my own intense transcendent experience in that gym in Kansas, which was in so many ways so ineffably beautiful, I also feel a dark resonance echoed in the image of Dr. Manhattan and the big sky. And I am reminded that paradoxically, transcendence has the ability to engender feelings of connection to everything, while also simultaneously engendering dangerous feelings of detachment from everything. Transcendent moments relieve us of our pain, and that certainly is a good thing. Alleviation of suffering is a good thing. But like any drug, it can be abused. So long as we are planning to remain bound to this mortal coil, perhaps it would be best if we thought of transcendence as a local analgesic rather than a general anesthetic, because life is not meant to be completely devoid of pain. As one of my favorite philosophers once said when faced with a hypothetical opportunity to have all his life's pain taken away from him by a well-meaning guru, pain and guilt are the things we carry with us, the things that make us who we are. If we lose them, we lose ourselves. I don't want my pain taken away. I need my pain. Those words come, of course, from James Tiberius Kirk from Star Trek V. As UUs, can we just officially make Star Trek the seventh source? That would make me so happy. Last week, I told you the apocryphal story, the very apocryphal story of a frog that fell into a boiling pot of milk. He kept swimming and churning inside that milk until it pretty much magically turned into butter, thus allowing him to jump off of it and escape. But the frog would have never churned that butter if he could not feel the heat of that boiling milk. As Unitarian Universalists, I believe we are called to cultivate a deep personal spirituality that ought to include the pursuit of transcendent experiences, absolutely. But as Unitarian Universalists, I also believe that we cannot afford to grow completely numb to the heat of the fires of injustice that consume this world. As one of my friends often reminds me, we cannot allow ourselves to grow so heavenly minded that we are of no earthly good to ourselves or to others. Transcendent experiences, mountaintop moments are amazing, but most of life is not lived in solitude on the top of a mountain. Life is lived in the valley, alongside other human beings, and we all need each other. That which accrues from visiting the mountaintop, the humbling sense of scale, the gratitude that flows from the awe and the wonder, the peace that passes all understanding, they are tools that give us the perspective and resiliency needed to keep moving, to keep fighting, to heal and transform a world that is sick with terror, suffering, and despair. if there is too much heaven on our minds, if we anesthetize ourselves with spiritual soma, if we choose to bliss out, we will never be motivated enough to establish heaven on earth. So my charge to us this week is this: go ahead and find your bliss, but use your bliss to bless this world. Amen, and blessed be.